Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Management Studies, SOMS, Master's Degree Programs. Master of Commerce, MCOM. First year. IBO 1 International Business Environment. Block-1 Concepts and Dimension. Unit-2 Theories of International Trade. 2.0 Objectives. After studying this unit, you should be able to describe the pattern of trade between two countries. Discuss how international trade is mutually beneficial to the trading countries. Explain the classical theory of trade. Describe the neoclassical theories of trade. Describe the modern theory of trade. 2.1 Introduction. Foreign trade has recently, and particularly after 1991, become an important as well as debatable issue for the Indian economy. The Union Budget presented in 1991 introduced a wide range of economic policy reforms related with industry and trade, ushering in an era of economic liberalism in the Indian economy. These reforms were designed to transform a closed and inward-looking economy into an open and outward-looking one by lifting controls on import and export of goods and services and by making rupee convertible. In the years that followed, our trade and industrial production have been growing at fairly high rates. There is no doubt that the liberal approach to economic policy will continue and the previous bias against international trade and investment will remain subdued in the foreseeable future. In this new economic environment, the teaching of economics will develop a serious gap if the students are not made aware of the basic principles and concepts of international trade. In this unit, you will learn the concept of absolute and comparative advantage, gains from trade, terms of trade and various theories of international trade. 2.2 Objectives of trade theories. The purpose of a trade theory is to explain the pattern of trade between two countries. What is meant by pattern of trade? Suppose India exports garments, gems and jewelry and a few other products to the United States, while the latter exports computer parts, such as hard disks, and other machines to India. This pattern of export and import of goods is known as the pattern of trade. The theory of international trade explains why such a pattern emerges and lists the factors which cause such a pattern. Trade between two nations is not just in goods. Trade in services is also quite important. If the United States provides banking and insurance services to the Indian citizens, say to the Indian exporters and importers, and if these services are provided from the United States, then it is to be regarded as the U.S. export of services to India. There are two main theories on pattern of trade, the classical or the Ricardian theory and the neoclassical theory or the Samuelson theory. The second objective of trade theory is to explain the pattern of specialization. A pattern of specialization tells us the kinds of products and their quantities a country would produce. In the above example, India would produce garments, gems and jewelry and other products and the United States would produce computer parts and other machines. India may or may not produce computer parts and machines which USA would produce and similarly USA may or may not produce garments and the gems and jewelry. The pattern of trade and the pattern of specialization will depend on the model you are using to explain these patterns. If you are using the Ricardian theory, then you come to the conclusion that USA would not produce garments or gems and jewelry in which India has specialized. But if you are using the neoclassical theory, then you would say that USA would produce the goods it is importing from India. The domestic industries that produce the goods that the country imports are known as import competing industries, e.g. garments for USA, computer parts for India, and those producing goods that the country exports are called export industries, e.g. computer parts for USA and garments for India. A country, however, will have industries whose products are neither exported nor imported, and the goods produced by them are called non-traded goods, such as domestic transportation, electricity, etc. The third objective of trade theory is to show that international trade is mutually beneficial to the trading countries. A country which is not engaged in trade with any country is in a state of autarky. The theory says that trade is better than autarky under any circumstances. However, how much trade a country should have and whether countries should restrict the quantities of exports and imports by customs duties, tariffs, quotas and taxes is quite another matter. These issues come in the category of trade policy, which will be discussed in Unit 4. 2.3 Ricardian Theory of Trade. Ricardian theory of trade focuses on the comparative advantage of the nation. Let us discuss them in detail. 2nd March 2001 Labor Theory of Value. Classical economists, such as David Ricardo, believed that labor is the only source of value of goods produced in the economy. This does not mean that no other inputs are required in production, but since the other inputs such as raw materials and capital goods are also produced by labor, ultimately it is the labor which determines the relative valuation of goods. Among other inputs, not produced by labor, land is given by nature in a fixed quantity. Landowners earn rent, which does not determine price, rather it is the price which determines how much rent the landowners will earn. Such an explanation of value is known as the labor theory of value. Let us understand it with the help of an example. Assume that it takes 3 hours of labor to make 1 yard of cloth and 5 hours of labor to 10 kg of wheat. The wheat and cloth markets are perfectly competitive and labor is free to move from wheat production to cloth production and vice versa. This implies that the wage rate will be same in the cloth and wheat industries. Let W be this wage rate. Then the average cost per unit. 1 unit of cloth is 1 yard and 1 unit of wheat is 10 kg. In cloth and wheat production will be respectively 3 watts and 5 watts. These will also be the prices of cloth and wheat respectively, because under perfect competition price is equal to average cost. Thus the relative price of cloth in terms of wheat is 3W 5W a third May, which simply means that 3/5 of a unit of wheat will buy 1 unit of cloth, or 6 kilograms. Wheat will exchange for 1 yard of cloth. In the terminology of classical economists, this exchange ratio is known as value, which is determined only by labor and nothing else. 2nd March 2002 Autarky Equilibrium. You should understand the importance of the labor theory of value. We are dealing with two markets simultaneously and therefore it is in the general equilibrium framework. The labor theory of value gives a simple explanation of how the relative price of two goods is determined. Since we do not intend to introduce money in the model, it is the relative price or the exchange ratio which will determine the production and demand in the two industries. We would of course assume that the labor requirements per unit of wheat or cloth, 5, 3, remain the same, no matter how many units of the two goods the economy produces. This assumption is known as the constant returns to scale, CRS. CRS means that the labor productivities are independent of the scale of output. What are the labor productivities in cloth and wheat production? These are 1/3 and 1/5 respectively. 1 hour of labor will produce 1/3 yard of cloth and 1/5 extend to 2 kg. Wheat. Labor productivity is just the reciprocal of the unit labor requirement. With 300 hours of labor available and fully employed at one time in an economy, the production possibility frontier is shown as AB. Look at figure 2.1, which shows production possibilities of wheat and cloth. Notice that if all labor are devoted to the production to cloth, then 100 units of cloth will be produced, and that if all labor go into wheat production, then 60 units of wheat will be produced. Thus the slope of the production possibility frontier is 60-100-35, which is the exchange ratio. In autarky, the economy's consumers will choose a point like P on the production frontier in such a way that their welfare is maximized. This inequilibrium, OW and OC, are the quantities of wheat and cloth respectively, both demanded and supplied. The point P, in other words, represents a general equilibrium in the economy where demand and supply in each of the two markets are equal. Figure 2.1, Production possibilities of wheat and cloth. Look at the screen. 2nd March 2003, Absolute advantage versus comparative advantage. Now let us look at another economy where the unit labor requirements are somewhat different because of an improved technology. We assume that 1 and 4 hours of labor produce respectively 1 unit of cloth and 1 unit of wheat. Since less labor is required to produce 1 unit of each good in the second country, call it a foreign country, it has what is called an absolute advantage over the first country, call it the home country. So far there is no trade between the two countries. But suppose there is trade now, and would it be correct to say the foreign country has no incentive to trade because it is more efficient in both goods, whereas the home country is too eager to trade because it is inefficient in the production of both goods? The answer is that the so-called absolute advantage does not determine the pattern of trade between two countries. It is the comparative advantage which is relevant. But what is comparative advantage? In home country, 3/5 of a unit of wheat is exchanged for 1 unit of cloth, and in the foreign country, a quarter of a unit of wheat will exchange for 1 unit of cloth. Since 3rd May, a quarter cloth is more expensive in terms of wheat in the home country than in the foreign country. Thus, the foreign country has comparative advantage in cloth production. But home country has comparative advantage in wheat production because here 3 units of cloth will exchange for 1 unit of wheat, which is less than 4 units of cloth which will exchange for 1 unit of wheat in the foreign country. Thus, though the foreign country has an absolute advantage in both goods, it has comparative advantage in only one, namely cloth. The home country has absolute disadvantage in both goods, but it has a comparative advantage in wheat. But what determines comparative advantage? In order to answer this question, let us find the labor productivities in the two countries in cloth and wheat production. Look at Table 2.1, which shows the comparative labor productivities in both countries. Table 2.1, Labor productivities. Look at the screen. As you remember, labor productivities are just the reciprocals of unit labor requirements. If we compare the ratios of the labor productivity in cloth to that in wheat production, we see that the foreign country has a higher ratio, 4:5:3, and therefore it is relatively more productive in cloth. On the other hand, if we compare the ratios of labor productivity in wheat to that in cloth production, the home country has a higher ratio, 3/5, a quarter, which shows that the home country is relatively more productive in wheat. Thus, the Ricardian theorem on trade pattern states that a country has comparative advantage in the good in which its relative labor productivity is higher than its trading partner, and tends to export this good and tends to import the good in which its trading partner has comparative advantage. As regards the pattern of specialization, the Ricardian theory states that a country completely specializes in the good in which it has comparative advantage. In the above example, the home country will produce only wheat and the foreign country only cloth because the relative labor productivity is assumed to remain constant. Obviously, with no change in labor productivity, the country will put all its labor in the production of the good in which its labor is relatively more productive. If this theory is taken to be true, then no country will have an import competing sector because the imported goods will not be produced at all in the country. 2nd March 2004 Free Trade and Gains from Trade. The countries will not trade with each other unless trade makes them better off. What we can show here is that free trade is always better than no trade. In course of this discussion we will further explain why in the Ricardian system this specialization is complete. Our starting point is the exchange ratios or values in the two countries in the pre-trade situation. For the home country the exchange ratio, 3/5 unit of wheat exchanged for 1 unit of cloth, is the slope of the production possibility frontier in figure 2.1. One may draw a similar diagram for the foreign country and the slope of its production possibility frontier will show the exchange ratio as 1st April unit of wheat for 1 unit of cloth. But there is another aspect of figure 2.1 which has not been fully explained, and this is the indifference curve drawn as a dotted curve, tangent to the production possibility frontier. At the equilibrium point P, the marginal rate of transformation, MRT, which is slope of the production possibility frontier, gives the rate at which wheat can be converted into cloth by shifting labor from wheat to cloth. This is again the same as the exchange ratio. The slope of the indifference curve measures the marginal rate of substitution, misses, or the rate at which the consumers will substitute wheat for cloth. At P, MRT misses 3.5. For the foreign country MRT misses 1.4. Let us assume that the two countries have no trade with each other. Now suppose that the home country shifts labor from cloth to wheat to produce an extra 3/5 unit of wheat at the cost of 1 unit of cloth. But this loss of 1 unit of cloth can be more than compensated through trade with the foreign country where only a quarter unit of wheat is required to buy 1 unit of cloth. In this exchange the home country gains from trade. Since trade is gainful, the home country will keep on reducing the production of cloth and increasing the production of wheat till it produces only wheat and complete specialization occurs. But will the foreign country also gain? We will soon find out. Theory of comparative advantage provides the basis for trade. When two countries are autarkies, there are four markets. Markets for wheat and cloth in the home country and the markets for wheat and cloth in the foreign country. If trade is free, there are no tariffs or quotas or any other kind of restriction on the movement of goods between the two countries, then the four markets get integrated into two markets, one world market for wheat and one world market for cloth. The exchange ratio between cloth and wheat will be determined in the world markets. What will be the exchange ratio when the world markets are in equilibrium? We can argue that it will lie between the exchange ratios in the two countries in the pre-trade situation, i.e., between 1st April and 3/5, which are simply the prices of cloth in terms of wheat in the foreign and home countries respectively. Since the foreign country is exporting cloth, the pressure of home country's import demand for cloth will raise the price of cloth a quarter to say 2/5. In the home country the opposite will happen. Since it is an importer of cloth, the foreign supply will keep adding to domestic supply and reduce the price of cloth from 3rd May to say 2/5. In other words, we are assuming that the equilibrium exchange ratio will be 2/5 in the world markets. Remember that in free trade the two countries will pay the same price for any good and the law of one price has to hold. Now we can make a comparison between free trade and no trade, assuming that in free trade both countries can exchange 2/5 unit of wheat for 1 unit of cloth. Remember that this exchange ratio was 3/5 in the home country and a quarter in the foreign country before trade. It is now easy to see that home country will gain by reducing the production of cloth and importing it, and the foreign country will gain by reducing the production of wheat and importing it. If the home country reduces cloth production by 1 unit, it can increase wheat output by third May unit. But out of this 3/5 unit of extra wheat, the home country can export 2/5 unit to the world market and import 1 unit of cloth in exchange. The consumer who lost 1 unit of cloth will get it back through import with country, and the country will end up with a surplus of 1st May unit of wheat. If the foreign country reduces the production of wheat by 1 unit, it can increase the production of cloth by 4 units. In the world market, 2 units of cloth will exchange for 1 unit of wheat. Thus the foreign country recovers the loss of 1 unit of wheat through import and has a surplus of 3rd February units of cloth. Thus, free trade benefits both countries who tend to specialize completely in the goods in which they have comparative advantage. 2nd March 2005 Terms of Trade. The definition of commodity terms of trade is the price of one good in terms of the other. In our case, the home country's terms of trade was 3/5 unit of wheat for 1 unit of cloth, whereas the foreign country's terms of trade was a 1/4 unit of wheat for 1 unit of cloth. As we have just argued, the equilibrium terms of trade in the world markets will be somewhere between 1st April and 3/5, and we have assumed that it is 2/5. In the context of trade, the terms of trade is the price of the exported good in terms of the imported good. Since the home country is an exporter of wheat, its terms of trade is 2/5 unit of wheat for 1 unit of cloth. But for the foreign country, which is a cloth exporter, the terms of trade is just the reciprocal of the home country's terms of trade, i.e., 2 units of cloth for 1 unit of wheat. International trade will not only change the autarky terms of trade of the two countries and bring them together at a common level, it will also change the relative wage rate. The ratio between the home country's wage rate and the foreign country's wage rate is known as the factorial terms of trade. The meaning of factorial terms of trade is number of hours of one country's labor that will exchange for 1 hour of the other country's labor. But one has to be careful in interpreting this concept. There is no exchange of labor between the two countries, there is only an exchange of goods. But goods embody labor are spent in production. Thus, trade determines factor terms of trade indirectly. We have just seen in the above that the commodity terms of trade will lie between 3rd May and 1/4. Can we find such limits for the factorial terms of trade? The answer is yes, and the limits for the factorial terms of trade are 1/3 and 4/5. To prove this, let us assume that W and W are respectively the wage rates in the home and foreign countries, measures either in terms of wheat or in terms of cloth. In the foreign country, which has comparative advantage in cloth, the average cost of cloth must be less than the home country's average cost of cloth. This is precisely why the home firms do not produce cloth. Since this average cost is W in the foreign country and 3 watts in the home country, W, 3W or W, 1/3. Remember that I and 3 are respectively the number of hours of labor required to produce 1 unit of cloth in the foreign and home countries. Since 4 and 5 hours of labor are required to produce 1 unit of wheat in the foreign and home countries respectively, and since the home average cost in wheat must be less than the foreign average cost, we must have 5W, 4W, or WW, 4/5. This shows that the factorial terms of trade will lie between 1st March and 4/5.
These numbers can be located in the table above, giving labor productivities, where 1/3 is simply the ratio of labor productivities in the two countries in cloth production and 4/5 is the ratio of labor productivities in the two countries in wheat production. 2.4 The Neoclassical Theory of Trade. The neoclassical theory focuses on the factor abundance, which determines the pattern of trade. Let us discuss the theory in detail. 2nd April 2001 Relative factor abundance. The pattern of trade in the Ricardian theory depends entirely on the technological differences between two trading countries, as reflected in their respective labor productivity ratios. it does not depend on how much labor each country has. The neoclassical theory, on the other hand, focuses on the latter aspect, namely factor endowments. In contrast to the Ricardian theory, the neoclassical theory assumes that there are at least two factors, say labor and capital, which are used in the production of goods. But the two countries have the same technology or the same production functions. They differ only in respect of relative factor endowments, one country being relatively labor abundant and the other relatively capital abundant. If K is the total supply of capital and L the total labor supply, then KL implies that the home country is relatively capital abundant and the foreign country relatively labor abundant. This is called the physical definition of relative factor abundance. There is an alternative definition. If the foreign country is relatively labor abundant, then labor must be relatively cheaper there. In other words, if W is the wage rate and R the rental of capital, then WR would imply that the home country is relatively capital abundant, or relatively scarce in labor endowment, and would therefore have a relatively higher wage rate. One should note that the second definition does not necessarily follow from the first. The reason is very simple. A country may be relatively scarce in labor, but this does not necessarily mean that the relative wage rate will be high, because it is quite possible that there is very little demand for the goods that require the use of labor intensively. Similarly, in a country where labor is plentiful, wage rate may be still very high because of extremely high demand for the goods in which labor is used intensively. The lesson that we learn is that it is not possible to determine the price of a factor only by looking at its supply. One has to look at the demand side also. 2nd April 2002 Factor intensity. Since at least two factors are needed to produce goods, it is necessary to look at the relative intensity of factor use. Let X and Y be the quantities of the two goods and L and K be the labor and capital used in their production. Let K and L be the capital and labor used in the production of X, and let K and L be the capital and labor used in the production of Y. If KL, then X is capital intensive and Y is labor intensive. In general, the capital-labor ratios will be different for different goods. For example, we would expect the production of gems and jewelry to be labor intensive and computer hardware to be capital intensive. 2nd April 2003 The assumptions of the neoclassical model. The neoclassical theory makes the following assumptions. I. Perfect competition. 2. Constant returns to scale, which means that if labor and capital inputs are doubled, output is also doubled. As a result of this assumption, that average cost of production becomes independent of the level of output that is produced. For instance, the average cost of X is WL plus RK, X, which can be written as W, LX, plus R, KX. The firms will change labor output ratio or the capital output ratio if and only if the wage rate changes relative to the rental price of capital in order to minimize cost. But if output changes, labor and capital inputs will change in the same proportion as output, keeping L, X and K, X constant. Thus, the average cost will not change when output is changed, but it will change in response to changes in the factor prices. What we have just said for good X is equally true for good Y. The relationship between average cost and factor prices will be discussed later. In two goods model, it is assumed that one good is labor intensive and the other capital intensive, and this status does not change. 4. Only goods move from one country to another, not factors. The countries have the same technologies to produce X and Y, for their factor endowments differ. One country is labor abundant and the other is capital abundant. 6. The factors of production are fully employed. There is no unemployment of labor or excess capacity. 2nd April 2004 Product price ratio and factor price ratio. Under the assumption of constant returns to scale, there is relationship between the product price ratio, i.e., PP, and the factor price ratio, i.e., WR. This is discussed in figure 2.2. As you know, in a competitive market, price is equal to average cost in the long run because profit is competed away. Therefore, the product price ratio is equal to the average cost ratio, i.e., the ratio between the average cost of X and the average cost of Y. In the figure 2 unit isoquants are drawn and these are marked as X-1 and Y-1. These isoquants represent one unit of output for each of the two products. Every good will be produced at the minimum cost by the profit-maximizing producers. AB is the isocost line whose slope is the factor-price ratio, WR. The cost-minimizing condition is that the marginal rate of technical substitution, measured by the slope of the isoquant, is equal to the factor-price ratio, measured by the isocost line. Thus, the input combinations at C and D are the cost-minimizing input combinations for producing one unit each of Y and X respectively. The cost of producing one unit of output is given either by OB in terms of labor or by OA in terms of capital. Since AB is tangent to both the isoquants, the cost of producing one unit, or the average cost, is the same for X and Y. Thus, with the factor-price ratio given by the slope of AB, the average cost ratio or the product-price ratio is 1, i.e., P is equal to 1, and at this factor-price ratio the capital-labor ratios of the two industries are represented by the slopes of the lines joining O with C and D. It is quite obvious that Y is capital-intensive and X is labor-intensive. Another important point to note is that the average cost measured by OA or OB for producing X or Y will remain the same no matter how many units of the two goods are produced. This is because the average cost, under constant returns to scale, is independent of output and responds only to changes in the factor-price ratio. Figure 2.2, Product-Price Ratio and Factor-Price Ratio. Look at the screen. Let us now see how the average costs in the two industries producing X and Y change when the wage-rental ratio, WR, rises. Common sense would suggest that since labor is intensively used in X and since it is the wage rate, W, that rises relatively to the rental price of capital, R, the average cost of X should rise relatively to the average cost of Y. In the figure 2.2, the initial situation is one of equal average costs or product prices of the two industries, and this happens because the isocost line is a common tangent to both isoquants. But if WR rises, the cost minimization points will not be on a common tangent, rather the two industries will minimize cost on different isocost lines. These two isocost lines are drawn as dotted lines, and Y industry will minimize cost at E, while X industry will minimize cost at F. Therefore, the average cost ratio, which is the same as the product price ratio, PP, is now OM on which is greater than 1. This proves the proposition that as WR rises, PP will rise if X is labor intensive. The general relationship between the factor price ratio and the product price ratio is that if the price of one factor rises relatively to that of the other factor, then the price of the good intensive in that factor will rise relatively to that of the other good. This relationship is crucial to prove the neoclassical trade theorem, which we take up next. 2.4. 5. The Hecht-Cherolin-Samuelson, HOS, theorem. The HOS theorem states that a country which is relatively abundant in labor will have comparative advantage in the labor-intensive good, and the relatively capital-abundant country will have comparative advantage in the capital-intensive good. Thus it is the factor abundance rather than technology which determines the pattern of trade. To prove the theorem we use the relationship between WR and PP, which we have just established. Assuming the X is labor-intensive, figure 2.3 shows this relationship. The figure shows that the foreign country is capital abundant and the home country labor abundant by the factor price definition of relative factor abundance, since WR. As a result of this, a comparison of autarky prices tells us PP, or the home country's relative price of X is less than the foreign country's relative price of X in autarky. Therefore, the home country, labor abundant, will export X, labor intensive, and the foreign country, capital abundant, will export Y, capital intensive. Figure 2.3, Pattern of trade. Look at the screen. As trade takes place, the two countries' autarky prices will converge to the equilibrium world price, just as in the Ricardian model, provided that there are no impediments to trade. The figure shows this equilibrium world price as PP, which is the commodity terms of trade at which trade will take place in equilibrium, and WR, as the factorial terms of trade in equilibrium. In the neoclassical model, free trade not only equalizes the relative commodity price in the two countries but also equalizes the relative wage rate. 2nd April 2006 Factor Price Equalization Theorem. Free trade in the neoclassical model will not only equalize WR in the two countries but will also equalize the real factor prices. This is known as the Factor Price Equalization Theorem. A proof of the theorem is given by using figure 2.2. In this diagram, one can measure the real wage rate and the real rental price of capital. Let us suppose that the slope of AB is WR*, which is the same in the two countries. But the slope of AB is equal to PCPB, also measures the marginal rate of technical substitution, or the slope of the isoquant marked as Y is equal to 1. Remember that the marginal rate of technical substitution is the ratio of the marginal productivities of factors, i.e., MPL/MPK, the ratio between the marginal productivity of labor and the marginal productivity of capital. Combine with this another implication of constant returns to scale, namely that if factors are paid their marginal productivities, total output is exhausted. These give us two equations. 1. MPL/MPK, PCPB, which implies that PB, MPL, is equal to PC, MPK. 2. OP, MPL, plus PC, MPK, is equal to 1. Substituting the first equation in the second equation, we get MPL is equal to 1 OB. Similarly, it can be proved that MPK 1 OA. The real reward of a factor is nothing but its marginal productivity. Since 1 OB and 1 OA are respectively the real wage and the real rental price of capital in Y, these must also be the real factor prices in X, because under perfect competition real factor prices cannot be different in the two industries. The X and Y isoquants drawn in figure 2.2 are the isoquants of both the home and the foreign countries, as their technologies are identical. Thus, with the slope of AB representing the equilibrium factorial terms of trade, trade will equate the real factor prices in the two countries. 2nd April 2007 Samuelson-Stolper Theorem. If the price of a good rises relatively to the price of the other good, what happens to the real factor prices? In order to answer this question, we go back to figure 2.2. Remember that if the isocost line is AB, P is equal to 1, the real wage rate is 1 OB and the real rental price of capital is 1 OA. If the isocost lines are the dotted lines, IM or FN, then P is greater than 1, i.e., the price of X rises relatively to the price of Y. Now the real wage rate is 1 OM measured in X and 1 OM measured in Y. In either case the real wage rate increases, because both ON and OM are less than OB. You may check that the real rental price of capital declines by looking at the vertical intercepts of IM and FN. Also recall that X is labor intensive in this case. This gives us the Samuelson-Stolper theorem, which states that as the price of a good rises relatively to the price of the other good, the real reward of the factor intensively used in the good whose price has risen, labor in this case, will rise, and the real reward of the factor unintensively used, capital in this case, will fall. 2nd April 2008 Rybczynski Theorem. So far we have discussed the neoclassical theory only in terms of the factor price definition of factor abundance. Let us now use the other definition, namely the physical definition of relative factor abundance. We start by again referring to figure 2.2, where we recognize the fact that the factor intensities, K, L, and K, L, depend entirely on the factor price ratio and will change only if the factor price ratio changes. Also, the factor price ratio will change only if the product price ratio changes, and the Samuelson-Stolper theorem teaches us just this. It then follows that if the product price ratio is constant, the factor intensities in the two industries will stay constant. Now we ask ourselves the following question: given the product price ratio, what will happen to the output in the two industries if the endowment, supply, of a factor of production changes? Since the product price ratio is assumed to stay constant, an increase in the supply of labor or capital will not change the factor intensities in the two industries. Then our answer will come from the following box diagram, figure 2.4. The box shows that the economy is endowed with OA amount of labor and AO amount of capital. The outputs produced in the two sectors are given by two isoquants marked as X and Y, which are tangent to each other at P. Under constant returns to scale, we may also measure output along rays through the origin. In other words, the output of X can be measured as OP and that of Y as OP. Note that at P the economy uses up all resources. In fact, at any point in the box full employment of labor and capital takes place, but at P the use of resources is optimal as the marginal rates of technical substitution, measured by the slopes of the isoquants for X and Y, are equal. Recall that this was also true in figure 2.2 because the isoquants of the two products were tangent to the same isocoast line or parallel isocoast lines. In other words, P is the point where the goods are being produced at the minimum cost. Also note that as in figure 2.2, X is the labor-intensive good and Y is the capital-intensive good. We can easily see this by comparing the slopes of OP and OP, which tells us that X industry uses less capital per unit of labor than Y industry. Now let the supply of labor increase by AB without any change in the supply of capital. Since this, as argued, will not charge the factor intensities, the new production point must be Q, with PQ being an extension of OP and O, P and O, Q parallel lines. The new production point clearly shows that the output of X rises from OP to OQ and that of Y falls from O, P to O, Q. Generalizing this result, we state the Rybczynski theorem: if the supply of a factor rises and the terms of trade remain constant, then the output of the good intensively using that factor will rise and the output of the good intensively using the other factor whose supply has not changed will fall. Figure 2.4, Relative Factor Abundance. Look at the screen. With the help of Rybczynski theorem, we can now see the validity of the HOS theorem in terms of physical definition of factor abundance. Let us suppose that the home country and the foreign country are identical in every respect, i.e., they have the same technology and factor supplies. Then the production of goods in the two economies can be represented by point P in figure 2.4 for both countries as their isoquants are identical. Let us assume that the consumers in the two countries have identical tastes and therefore identical demand functions. As a result, the relative price of X in terms of Y will be identical in the two countries. Now suppose the home country's labor endowment increases by AB. The production point for the home country will be Q and that for the foreign country will be P. In other words, the home country becomes a labor-abundant country and the foreign country a capital-abundant country. But now the two countries cannot have the same relative price of X in terms of Y in their respective autarky equilibria. This is because the home country will produce more X and less Y than the foreign country. With identical tastes of consumers in the two countries, the relative price of X in terms of Y in the home country will be less than that in the foreign country. Thus X will be relatively cheaper in the home country which produces too much of it and Y relatively dearer as 100 little of it is produced. Therefore the HOS theorem is valid as the home country which is labor abundant has comparative advantage in X which is labor intensive and the capital abundant foreign country has comparative advantage in Y which is capital intensive. 2.5 Modern theories of trade. The contemporary theories of trade deviate from the assumptions of perfect competition and constant returns to scale made both in the classical and the neoclassical models. In the modern theories, the market structure is either monopolistic or oligopolistic. In the former case, a large number of producers produce goods that are not identical but differentiated in quality or design. In the latter case, only a few producers serve the market with either identical products or differentiated products. The products which are just differentiated horizontally are similar in quality but different in design, like a red pen and a blue pen, white wine and red wine, or wooden furniture and steel furniture. Vertical product differentiation involves quality differences as in small cars and large cars. If the products are horizontally differentiated, they are produced by more or less the same technology. Vertical product differentiation would invariably mean that the technology varies with quality or type of the product. The modern theories assume economy of scale in production. An example of economy of scale is shown in the following Table 2.2. Table 2.2, Economy of Scale. Look at the screen. One may easily check that the technology described above is a departure from the constant returns to scale we have been using so far. For example, the output is doubled from 1 to 2 as labor is less than doubled from 3 to 5. Suppose that there are two similar goods, A and B, being produced by the above technology. The economy has 10 units of labor. The consumers will consume the two goods in 1:1 proportion. Therefore the labor force will have to be equally divided in the production of the two goods, and 2 units each of A and B will be produced and consumed in the economy. Now suppose there is another economy with the same technology to produce A and B having 10 units of labor. Then it is quite easy to see that one economy produces only A and the other produces only B and then trade with each other. Then the consumers in each country will be able to consume 3.5 units each of A and be better off than autarky. This is an example of trade taking place between two countries having the same technology and factor endowments simply due to economy of scale. But there is difference in the nature of trade. In the earlier models, the products were different and produced by different technologies, and the trade was between two industries, such as one country exporting cloth and importing wheat. This kind of trade is called inter-industry trade. But in the contemporary models, trade is intra-industry, i.e., in the same industry located in two different countries. It is like one country exporting white wine and importing red wine, both goods requiring the same technology as in the above example. It turns out that a very substantial part of world trade is intra-industry in nature, which shows the importance of modern theories in the contemporary world. 2.6 Summary. Trade theories explain the pattern of trade between two countries, the pattern of specialization and the mutual benefit of the trade. There are various trade theories to explain above phenomenon. Ricardian theory states that a country has comparative advantage in the good in which its relative labor productivity is higher than its trading partner and tends to export this good. The country turns to import the good in which its trading partner has comparative advantage. Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson theorem emphasizes that a country which is relatively abundant in labor will have comparative advantage in the labor-intensive good, and the relatively capital-abundant country will have comparative advantage in the capital-intensive good. This theory advocates that it is the factor abundance rather than the technology which determines the pattern of trade. The modern theories of trade assumes monopolistic or oligopolistic market structure and economy of scale in production. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.